Thanks very much, Les. Look, thanks all for coming out on a cold, wet night. I want to keep this relatively casual. Journos probably work best when they're exchanging questions and answers and barbs and things like that. So I'd be really keen at the end of my chat for anyone here to just throw a zillion questions my way on anything you like, because defence, and one of the reasons why I'm very pleased to be here tonight is I think I'm a bit grumpy at the moment, because I think that the government, to a degree, and I apologise to some of the members of the government who are here tonight, has, it's not your portfolio, it has been very disingenuous, I think, about the defence debate in Australia, about the way they've gone about it, about what they've promised, about the way they argue it, and about the way they plan to pay for it. So, and I think that I've been a journo a long time, so I've seen a lot of these cycles. I've seen governments be more honest about this stuff. I've seen them be very dishonest about this stuff. Certainly, they're leaning very strongly towards the dishonest side at the moment, and I'll tell you why. Just before I do, I'll start with a small anecdote. Les referred to the fact that in December I received probably what every journalist dreams of, and that was a draft copy of that's just the cover. There's a bit more to it, not a lot more, of the defence white paper. And I remember it was one of those moments you think, oh my gosh, it was an unclassified version, so I wasn't breaking the law by reporting it. And so I went through it and sort of in awe of this situation, and called up the Defence Minister's office at 6 p.m. that night before we were going to publish, and said, look, I've got a copy of the white paper here, and there's this complete silence at the end of the phone. I remember thinking, okay, rightio. So they said, well, get back to you in 20 minutes. So I put the phone down. They came back and they said, oh, that copy you've got is outdated. It's been rewritten and it's virtually useless, effectively. And I looked at the date on the bottom of this, and it was only 10 days before the publication that I had it. So I thought, that's strange. So I talked to the editors, and we decided that they were probably telling a porky here. So we went very big on it, all over the front page. And the reason why I tell this story is because when the real version came out 10 days ago, oh my God, it was almost word for word. The front half of the document about Australia's strategic relations with the world was almost word for word. And my point, I guess, being that the governments are willing to tell porkies when it comes to defence and security. So I just want to basically have a bit of a chat about some of those, the issues which I think are really important at the moment, and where I think a lot of Australians who, unlike you guys, who are a much more informed crowd than your average sort of voters out in the burbs who are just not going to pay much attention to defence policy unless there's a war. I think that it's very unfair for the government to be dishonest on a lot of these levels. So, look, basically I think the government should be held to account on its promises. That's the job of myself and other journos to report on defence and foreign affairs. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail, but we do enjoy fighting the good fight. So I'd like to give you a journo's insight into the politics and some of the porkies which go on behind the scenes in relation to Australia's defence and national security. As you'll see, the way defence decisions are made these days sometimes leads to good and sensible policy. There are some good decisions. Other times it leads to a policy which would make even Humphrey Appleby blush. But there's really been a more relevant time to discuss these issues, because, of course, 10 days ago the government did release its blueprint for Australia, which is the 2013 Defence White Paper. And it comes at a unique time for Australia when the country is what I believe is in a phase of historic strategic retreat. We're in strategic retreat, firstly, because of the natural conclusion of missions in Iraq and East Timor, as well as the pending conclusions in Afghanistan and the Solomon Islands. But we're also in retreat because of the recent and remarkable bipartisan collapse in political support for defence spending. All this is happening against the backdrop of the great uncertainty in our region about the posture of the two giants of the Pacific, China and the United States, and about how Australia needs to position itself in relation to these two, its largest trading partner and its closest ally. This is the first defence white paper since 2009, and it's fair to say it's divided the critics. It calls for a greater focus on our near region and on closer military ties with countries in the region. That's really its centrepiece. As such, it moves away from the notion that Australia is contributing to far-flung military campaigns abroad as one of its priorities. And yet, it retains a highly ambitious series of promises, future big-ticket items for the Australian Defence Force, from 12 homemade submarines, the biggest single spending commitment of any government since Federation, dwarfing the Snowy Mountains scheme. It's an astonishing promise which the government is putting forward in this. Add to this, in the white paper, the promises of new frigates, muscular frigates, patrol boats, supply ships, 3 new air warfare destroyers, easily the most deadly ship Australia has ever had when they're built, not to mention 100 new fighter jets. Some might say, in lots of ways, that this is a white paper. It's a Rolls-Royce white paper, if you like, on a Holden budget. But I think it's important to place this white paper in context. We need to have a very quick and very simple look at the history of Australia's defence policy. I think it's fair to say that the modern Australian defence strategy we see today was born in 1986 with the release of the so-called DIB report by the academic Paul Dibb. This led to the revolutionary 1987 Defence White Paper. This basically said that the Defence Force exists primarily to defend the Australian continent, not as an adjunct to the United States in far-flung conflicts around the world. Now, this may seem simple to us now, but it wasn't really at that point in time. This document was framed in an era when the pain of the Vietnam War was still very real. There was little appetite for overseas military adventures undertaken largely to water the ANZUS alliance with the US, and so the 87 White Paper enshrined the concept of defence self-sufficiency and the direct defence of Australia as the holy grail of the Australian Defence Force. To do this, it completely shook up traditional thinking. It called for homemade submarines. That had never been done before. New military centres in the north and the west. The big bases in Perth didn't exist. It was a grand vision, but it also said in order to realise this dream, governments needed to spend more than 3% of gross domestic product on defence. They were dreaming. As it turned out, the recession Australia had to have in the early 90s put paid to that. Defence spending slumped, and so the grand promises of that landmark Defence White Paper have arrived in dribs and drabs over the past 25 years, and some are still arriving. Now, the Howard government was initially not much more committed to defence spending. I mean, the thing with defence spending is that there's lots of competing priorities. You know, everyone understands that, and in that time, there really wasn't seen to be an imperative to implement the grand promises of the 87 White Paper. But this actually changed, you might recall, in 1999 when the East Timor crisis came along. John Howard discovered to his horror that defence had become so run down and so hollowed out, it could barely send a single battalion of troops to deal with the crisis in nearby Timor. It was embarrassing. So Howard promised defence would have 3% real increase in spending each year to put it back into shape. It's a big promise. He foreshadowed the purchase of the yet-to-be-built Joint Strike Fighters and 3 of the new air warfare destroyers. At the same time, he oversaw deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, East Timor and the Solomons. It was, if you like, the most active period in lots of ways in Australia's defence since the Vietnam era. Now, Kevin Rudd came to power and he liked Howard's muscular approach to defence policy. He liked the kudos it gave him. Rudd also saw himself as very much a foreign policy expert. He wasn't a defence expert, but he liked to adopt that as well to a degree. He was very, very interested in all aspects of defence policy, but Rudd was also obsessed with the rise of China as a Chinese expert. And he believed Australia needed a long-term defence and security plan to deal with a nation that might one day become an adversary. And at this time, in fact in 2008, the year after Rudd was elected, there was a pitched battle inside the Department of Defence, which was obviously behind closed doors, but it was a very colourful one, between, for want of another word, the hawks and the doves on China. The doves, which included DFAT, Foreign Affairs, and the intelligence agencies, saw China's expansion as a natural, non-threatening extension of its rapid economic growth. The hawks, led by several people inside the Defence Department, saw it as part of a broader ambition to develop a military which could project power far from China's shores and potentially threaten stability in the region. So Rudd came in and he had a look at the both arguments and he decided to go with the hawks. The result was the 2009 Defence White Paper, the one before this one, which promised the greatest naval expansion in Australia's peacetime history, including a plan to double from 6 to 12 the size of the submarine fleet. It was supremely ambitious, and according to the Rudd government, it would require real increases in defence spending of between 2.2 and 3%. They're real increases on top of inflation, until 2030 to fund it. So there we go, that was Rudd's big vision. Then it got tossed, and Julia Gillard came in. And of course, the GFC started to bite as well. But this is where it becomes really bizarre. In May last year, so literally 12 months ago in last year's budget, rather than increase funding in accordance with the Rudd plan, the government slashed it by 10% or 5.5 billion, the whole defence budget. Defence budgets are often measured in terms of GDP, of ratio to GDP. It's a common way to do it because it gives an impression of the relative importance of defence spending compared to other things in the economy. It's a common way to do it. Anyway, so they slashed the defence spending to 1.54% of GDP, the lowest level as a percentage since 1938. This represents a remarkable departure from conventional thinking on defence spending, because that conventional thinking, and this is where defence is weird, it's a weird area of the economy, because the conventional thinking was this, and this was the case for more than a decade, is that you can't turn defence spending on and off like a tap to meet your political goals of retaining a surplus. That's not to say there shouldn't be a robust debate about how much we spend on defence versus health, education, etc. I'm a big fan of that debate, and in fact I'm not necessarily a strong proponent of very large defence spending, but I am a proponent of really having a government that matches your shopping list with your income. And once you've determined the correct amount to spend, I contend it's dangerous to then use the defence budget as a plaything, as we're now seeing. In an interview 10 days ago, Defence Minister Stephen Smith criticised those who believe, and I quote, that you can map out for defence a guaranteed share of spending with dedicated growth paths from 2009 to 2030 over 21 years. Well, life's not like that. And the global financial crisis taught everyone that life is not like that. Well, Smith's comments infuriated a former head of the Defence Department, Paul Barrett, who I believe will be speaking here in a few weeks. Now, Paul wrote on his blog, obviously he was a bit angry. He said, I've got news for the Defence Minister. When you're dealing with defence procurement and capability development, life is exactly like that, or at least it needs to be, because acquisition is a complex defence platform like a submarine or a ship takes 20 years or more. In order to manage such projects and be in a position to enter legally binding contracts between the Commonwealth of Australia and the supplier, Department of Defence needs to know how much money it's likely to have over the relevant time scale. And these are the examples he put. They're very interesting. Planning for a replacement for the Oberon-class submarines, they're the ones that preceded the Collins class, began in the late 70s. The winning design was announced in 1987 and the submarines were built between 1990 and 2003. A major capital investment over a quarter of a century. A quarter of a century is the time between the First and Second World War. He also says planning for these replacements for the Collins class boats began in 2007. These boats will enter service in the late 2030s. And on the Joint Strike Fighter, he says Australia signed up to the Joint Strike Fighter program in 2020. The first tranche of 14 aircraft will be delivered no earlier than about 2019, and it will be well into the 2020s by the time we've got a full capability. Meanwhile, we have to make a stopgap purchase of Super Hornets. The fact is, if the government wants Defence to manage its procurement, facilities and investment throughout, and life support, and training programs efficiently and effectively, it needs to give the department reasonable predictability of funding. This is not a year-by-year business. Now, in fact, Stephen Smith would have agreed with that before the GFC. So it's a really interesting debate about how you manage something like defence, which is such a weird beast when it comes to funding. But having made such hefty cuts to defence spending last year, in order to fund a surplus which never materialised, the government has had to consider what to do in this year's budget released yesterday. I think the government was slightly embarrassed by the amount of criticism it received from the cuts last year, and having already abandoned its quest for a surplus, it was able to promise a very small increase in defence spending yesterday, lifting spending as a portion of GDP from 1.54% to 1.6%, so it's a very small thing. But for the foreseeable future, and this is the relevant point, defence spending in Australia will be virtually flat, with only marginal increases at the best. Now, if we're doing a household budget and our income goes down by 10%, as it did, what do? When we shop, we simply purchase less. But this is my problem. When it comes to defence policy, such pragmatism makes a party politically vulnerable. This is where the defence debate has become very dishonest. When Labor was planning this new white paper, it chose not to tailor its shopping list to a clearly reduced defence budget and a clearly reduced fiscal circumstance for Australia across the board in every single sector. It feared that to do so would leave it open to coalition claims that it was weak on national security ahead of the election. This has been one of Labor's great fears all the way through, with terrorism, with defence, anything to do with national security. It is scared blind that the coalition will outflank it on the right, because it traditionally has. And so it gives no room, and that's why you see a very conservative defence and foreign and security policy when it comes to the government. The bottom line is that Labor was worried, it didn't want to tailor its shopping list, and instead it promised a shopping list of warships, fighter planes and submarines, every bit as extravagant as the 2009 Rudd White Paper, yet with none of its promises for the same funding. What does this mean in real life terms? It means the White Paper is largely, I hate to say it, a feel-good document. Harsher critics might call it a fantasy. It's certainly not going to be realised in any time frame that's vaguely realistic. It amounts to a wish list, a political document which is aimed at convincing the electorate ahead of the election that the government is serious about defence and security. Current levels of defence spending at the moment would fund not much more than half of the $275 billion worth of promises in this white paper. That's how much they've promised. It simply won't happen anytime soon, and the likely outcome is that major projects will be deferred some into the never. Now, so I'm sad to say that that serious policy making on the vital questions of Australia's national security has been trumped by the politics of elections, and I believe the national debate is all the poorer for it. But perhaps here the big story is not the government, perhaps it's the opposition, because the coalition, by all accounts, the likely government in 6 months' time, if you believe the Australian News poll, it's criticised the government, it's bagged the government on defence policy all the way through. You're not committed, you don't spend enough, you don't fulfil your promises. Fine, it's done all that. What's it done? Nothing. It has promised no more in funding than the government. It's promised only to do what the government says, and that is an aspiration to increase defence spending eventually back to 2% of GDP, which is the level with which many serious defence analysts believe it needs to be to sustain a credible defence force in Australia. So the practical outcome of this bipartisan demotion of the importance of defence spending in Australia is actually quite real, and it's quite interesting. In terms of the actual equipment, and I'll just go through a couple of these things, it means that the planned new submarines will not be in service until probably the 2040s, or at least the late 2030s. Now, many of us won't be here to see this. I certainly won't be around to report on it. There's likely to be at least some years when Australia has no working submarines at all. The government claims it will avoid such a gap by extending the life cycle of the 6 Collins-class boats by a further 8 years until the late 2030s. But its technical ability to do this is unproven, and the strategic use of submarines at such an advanced age, I think, is highly dubious. We'd be talking about submarines that were 40 years old, new technology. I'd be scared to ride on things, would much rather fire a shot on them. And I think they'd be put into that strange category like the F-111s used to be in Australia towards the end, where they're nice and pretty for the Grand Prix and the Melbourne Cup, and submarines won't be, but like the F-111s fly over the top, do all the grand stuff for the PR, but basically they can't be used in conflict because they're just too old. I think that's the sort of danger you'd get. And the Air Force is also unlikely anytime soon to get its full quota of 72 Joint Strike Fighters to complement its 36 Super Hornets. But for once, this is not the government's fault. Rather, it's the fault of Lockheed Martin in Fort Worth, Texas, which is struggling to build these planes on time, on budget, and with the promised capabilities. What happened in the White Paper, I think, is a sensible decision, and that was to purchase 12 new Growler electronic warfare versions of the Super Hornet as a stopgap until the Joint Strike Fighters are finally built and they finally fly and they finally work. And I think this was a good decision which was effectively forced upon the government. But look, take away the equipment issues, I'd like to talk a bit about the strategy which underpins the White Paper, because it's really interesting, because again, it's very much infused with politics rather than what the government actually, I think, feels in its heart. For example, the blueprint calls for a closer defence focus on Australia's immediate region, saying it's justified because of the ending of the large missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, as fate might have it, Australia won't have the money to do much more than be a policeman in its own backyard in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia, so you might say this is a strategy for austere times. It certainly heralds a less ambitious and less capable era for the ADF than we've seen over the past decade. I think in some areas this notion of closer defence ties with the region, the White Paper has delivered a sophisticated and nuanced approach to Australia increasing and improving its defence links with these countries. I think it's to be applauded, and I think it improves our security at very little cost. What is fascinating, however, and I'd love for you guys to ask me questions or at least chat about this a bit more later. What's fascinating is the approach that this White Paper takes to China. This Defence White Paper is a cuddly panda when it comes to China. The Gillard government gives the impression of being so wary of offending Beijing. It has censored from this document any suggestion, this is the blueprint for Australia's security, any suggestion of military ambition from the world's fastest growing military power. If you compare Kevin Rudd's 2009 White Paper with Julia Gillard's version last week, you might wonder whether they are talking about the same country. Rudd's 2009 document spoke frankly of how, quote, China will be the strongest Asian military power by a considerable margin, and that, quote, its military modernisation will be increasingly characterised by the development of power projection capabilities. It even went on to chide Beijing for being too secretive about the pace, scope and structure of its military modernisation. There we go, lost where I was. Yeah, but now look, some might say this was a little too blunt, because I mean certainly the Chinese thought it was blunt. The Chinese hauled Australian officials over the coals when the officials were sent to Beijing to brief them on this, and we know this thanks to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, because it was one of the documents that was that actually released. So we know the Chinese were really upset by it, but I mean, let's be blunt here, China will be the strongest Asian nation in the future by a considerable margin. Indeed, it already is. Its military modernisation will increasingly be characterised by power projection capabilities. That's already happening, with China commissioning more new submarines than any other nation and even buying an old aircraft carrier. And China is famously secretive about the size and the scope of its defence spending. All these things are true, but the Chinese clearly saw the Rudd White Paper as undiplomatic and interpreted the plan to double the Australian submarine fleet as being directed against it. So here we are, 4 years on. Now this is interesting. What does the government do in this situation? They don't want to upset China again, but it's very hard to make radical changes in defence policy when you're building ships and planes and things. So at the practical level, it retained the strategy which so riled Beijing in 2009, and that is the plan to double the submarine fleet. That's been kept. By 100 high-powered warplanes, that's been kept. Since 2009, Australia has also sidled up even more to the United States. We now have rotations of US Marines on Australian soil up in Darwin. That wasn't the case before. But in rhetoric, the White Paper pretends that none of this is in any way predicated on a rising China. This year's white paper had not a hint of criticism about any of China's rapid military modernisation, despite it being the key priority of Western intelligence agencies and a source of concern to many countries in the region. Instead, parts of this white paper read like a thank you note to Beijing rather than a frank assessment of how China's military rise is impacting on the region. And I quote, "Australia welcomes China's rise," this is from the document, "Australia welcomes China's rise, not just because of the social and economic benefits it's brought, but also in recognition of the benefits that it has delivered to states around the globe," the document says. Quote, "China's defence capability is growing and its military is modernising as a natural and legitimate outcome of its economic growth," end quote. In recent weeks, and I know this because I had the draft document of this, and that's sort of final document, in recent weeks defence planners even edited from the final document a reference to China having, quote, "growing economic, diplomatic and business presence in the South Pacific nations." This harmless sentence was contained in the advanced draft which I got, but in the final version, the word China was removed from the South Pacific section and replaced with the words Asian nations. Now, none of this, don't get me wrong, none of this is just to suggest that the white paper should go out of its way to offend China. Of course it shouldn't. And you can make a valid argument that by editing blunt rhetoric about a rising China, you do win easy diplomatic kudos, which indeed it did, because the Chinese this week welcomed the white paper, or at least the rhetoric of the white paper, saying it showed, quote, "respect for the relationship." But the reality is there is a global debate about China's military ambitions, what they mean for the region and for the world and for Australia. To pretend in Australia's official defence policy document that this is not happening, I think, ignores the elephant in the room. I personally believe Australia should not be so fearful of speaking frankly on China that it censors itself in its own strategic blueprint. We've gone from one extreme to the other, in my opinion. Even so, on a more positive note, I think the white paper does make the right noises about the greatest strategic challenge facing Australia this century, and that is the need to carefully balance our relations with both China and the US. The white paper makes the obvious but important point that Australia doesn't have to choose between the two. It welcomes the Obama administration's so-called pivot of its forces towards Asia rather than Europe. It also focuses on a rising India and coined a new phrase, the Indo-Pacific, to describe Australia's key area of strategic interest, although this partly reflects the hobby horse of the Perth-based Defence Minister. Now, I think it's important, finally before I open for questions, is what will we see if a coalition government is elected in September? Firstly, we'll see the difficult and dangerous implementation of a policy of using the Navy to turn around asylum seeker boats. The Navy does not like this prospect one bit, and it raises a host of legal and humanitarian questions. However, I think given the current flow of asylum seeker boats to Australia and the political noise it is creating, I don't think you'll see Abbott reverse on this policy. I think we're going to see a really difficult and painful episode after the election when it comes to the use of Navy intercepting asylum seeker boats. Secondly, I don't think a coalition government, an Abbott government, will see any great change in the wish list of these large defence capabilities, even though it probably won't promise the funding which can deliver them in anything like a realistic time frame. The only exception to this may be that the coalition may choose a submarine which is designed overseas rather than in Australia. Labor has rejected this concept, saying no such suitable design exists and it would produce submarines if they went overseas, which are too small and which lack the range needed by the Navy. But the coalition is more anxious than Labor to reduce the risk of the $36 billion project, and it sees an overseas design modified for Australian conditions, built in Adelaide, as less risky than an untested, entirely original Australian design. Coalition governments, I think, are also historically more willing to contribute to overseas military campaigns in the name of supporting the US alliance. But at present, there really don't seem to be any obvious new fronts for a conflict which would involve Australia. And I think this has been one of the factors that people who are calling for defence cuts would have argued. They would have said, okay, where is Australia's next war? Where is Australia's next battle? And when you think of it, these things really don't pop up overnight unless they're humanitarian conflict, humanitarian disasters. So at present, I mean, Iraq was a slow burn. Afghanistan was a very slow burn. And at the moment, I really think you have the only two places I think that hold the potential for Western involvement is Syria and Iran. And neither of those, especially under this blueprint, are going to be places that the Australian government, regardless of its political stripes, is going to want to send anything more than the smallest niche contribution. So it's really hard to see exactly where the next big deployment of Australian troops is going to go. And the fact is, I think this has fed a lot into the defence debate. And finally, I think the coalition says it seeks to stamp its own imprint on defence policy by writing yet another white paper within 12 months of gaining office. My God, I've got another one. Meaning that this current white paper would have a shelf life of barely 18 months. Now, they used to turn up every 5 or 10 years. Barely 18 months, this white paper, in an industry where, as I said before, building a submarine takes 25 years. I think short-term planning is infecting Australia's defence policy and its defence planning. As I said, it's unlikely the Abbott government will promise any more money for defence spending, so my prediction is this. Defence policy will chug along in the background of national public debate in Australia until the next crisis comes along. And then, like it did with Timor, with Howard, the leader of the day will feign shock at the rundown state of the Australian Defence Force, of the Army, of the Navy, of the Air Force, and it will pump money back into it while thumping their chest about the importance of defence and national security. We've seen this cycle before, and I believe we are doomed, if you like, to see it again. So I think let's just hope, for all our sakes, that there's no crisis which forces the government to admit that it's been barking loudly while brandishing a very small stick when it comes to safeguarding Australia's defence and security. Thank you.